One winter's afternoon, during those turbulent days of the late 1830s, a party of trekkers outspanned under this 1,000-year-old fig tree, not very far from the banks of the Artes River. Their leader was Andries Hendrik Potgieter, and he was taking his people north to the distant Zoutpansberg. Now, Potgieter was a man of great vision, and he came up with an idea that convinced his followers that he was crazy. He dreamt, and remember this is the 1830s, he dreamt of a railway line from the Transvaal to the sea. 2 years later, he was negotiating with the Portuguese governor of Mozambique for a line from Delagoa Bay to the newly established seat of government at Potchefstroom. And this was barely 9 years since Stephenson Rocket had made that epic journey from Manchester to Liverpool. In the end, of course, nothing came of Potgieter's dreams. But had he been able to go ahead, one wonders how different our history might have been. Not far from here, a town sprang up that was in time to become the capital of the Transvaal Republic. They called it Pretoria. And one day in the summer of 1874, one would have found Thomas Francois Burgers, the energetic president of the Transvaal Republic, using all his eloquence and persuasion to bring members of the Volksraad around to his way of thinking on a project that was far in advance of the views of his people at that time. The subject under discussion, as you probably guessed, was a railway. You see, like Potgieter before him, Burgers was convinced that Delagoa Bay was the natural port for the Transvaal, and that having a railway outlet there would avoid goods from overseas having to be carted through either one or other of the two British colonies at exorbitant rates. Well, his eloquence and his enthusiasm eventually won the day, and with the blessing of the majority of the Volksraad, he was soon on his way to Holland, where he hoped to raise the equivalent of 600,000 rands, which was 4 times the Transvaal's annual budget. He sailed from Cape Town well enough prepared, tucked away in his baggage with samples of every mineral he could lay hands on. There was gold, of course, there was cobalt, there was iron, there was tin, there was copper, even a bit of coal. And with these, he hoped to persuade would-be investors of the treasure trove of minerals in the Transvaal just waiting to be exploited. Although his bubbling enthusiasm was infectious, he failed to persuade the hard-headed moneylenders of Amsterdam. And so with weary feet, he trod the city streets. And in the end, the best deal he could manage was a complicated debenture issue to be repaid by installments on the basis of all unlikely things, of a lottery. Although this produced only about a quarter of what was needed, it was better than nothing, and he straightway spent most of it on railway equipment. But when he got back home, he found the Republic in such deep financial trouble that he had to abandon his dreams. And most of that expensive equipment was left to rust on the shores of Delagoa Bay. But let's leave the Transvaal and its problems for a moment and take a look at what was happening to the East London line, which was making its way north from Queenstown to the Orange River. Ahead loomed this great mountain barrier, the Stormberg, towering more than 1,800 meters above the sea. Here was a mighty challenge, even more formidable than the one tackled in the Hex River Kloof a few years before. Who would accept the challenge? Well, there was always one man who was prepared to give it a bash. He, of course, was George Pawling. He began construction at Sterkstroom, where the ground starts to rise to the Stormberg Plateau. And he cut, and he bridged, and he wound his way around mountain peaks. And in September 1884, he reached the little village of Maltino. And here, at 1,600 meters above sea level, up in the clouds where the storms are brewed, someone had discovered coal. Yet, as Christmas 1885 approached, and the wealthy merchants weighed their precious diamonds and counted out their gold sovereigns, fate had a surprise in store. because in a few short months, on a lonely Transvaal farm, a man was to discover gold. We've come a long way since that winter's day in 1886, when George Harrison, out for an afternoon stroll, stumbled on a bit of outcrop reef that was to spark an industrial explosion and to spawn a mushrooming, money-mad metropolis called Johannesburg, virtually on Pretoria's doorstep. At once, the focus of world attention swung from Britain's Cape Colony to Paul Kruger's Boer Republic, and all eyes turned on Johannesburg, a town that wasn't even on the map, and yet it was to become the largest city in the world ever built so far from any waterway. So, in the old days, how on earth did you get here? Well, you could take ship to one of the Cape ports, and from there by train to Kimberley or Colesberg or even Allowell North. Now, if you're in a hurry, and who wasn't, of course the quickest way was from Cape Town to Kimberley. And from there, if you could afford it, by fast coach to Pretoria. Now that would take you and the other 14 passengers 3.5 days over wretched roads. And then you'd still have to face another 3.5 hours from Pretoria to Johannesburg, provided the Yukskay River wasn't in flood and the drift impassable. Now, if you didn't have that sort of money, you could always go by ox wagon or simply walk. One May morning in the year 1860, that's to say just 9 months after driver Dabbs and his famous engine landed in Cape Town, a 24-horsepower contractor's locomotive was landed in packing cases at Durban Harbour and reassembled in a shed near the Market Square by a man named Henry Jacobs. 1 month later, on a bright and blustery Saturday afternoon, a special train with the acting governor on board, company bigwigs, engineers and other dignitaries, and the chairman and directors on the footplate went puffing out of the station on its 5-minute journey to the point. You see, although the Cape Town to Wellington line had had a head start, the contractor there had dragged his heels so much that the honour of becoming the first passenger train to operate south of Cairo fell not to the Cape, as everybody expected, but to Natal. It was at once an impressive and never-to-be-forgotten moment. A century and a half ago, Hendrik Potgieter dreamt of a rail link to the sea at Delagoa Bay. 40 years later, President Burgers had the same idea. But it was left to President Paul Kruger to make that dream a reality. 3 years before Johannesburg was born, he'd succeeded in persuading financiers in Holland to put up the money for a line to the Portuguese border. At the same time, the Portuguese entrusted their concession for the line from Delagoa Bay to the Transvaal border to an American financier named Edward McMurdo. Naturally, that started the Transvaalers thinking, because what if McMurdo were to raise his finance in London? That would mean that the Republic's precious railroad would have to link to a section built by the British, and that was the last thing that Kruger wanted. Well, in the end, that's just what McMurdo did. In spite of all his promises, he sold his concession to a company in London. And for Kruger and his colleagues, that was a bitter blow. A century ago, the so-called port of Delagoa Bay, now Maputo, where Kruger's line was due to start, was little more than a collection of sand-swept hovels seething with malaria on the edge of a stinking swamp. And thanks to McMurdo's wheeling and dealing, the builders on this section would now be British. All told, 200 white men and 3,000 blacks went to work on the Portuguese section of the line as it headed towards the Transvaal border, 88 kilometers away. Before 6 months were out, they were going to be dropping like swatted flies from fever, and 200 of them would die. But still, despite all this, the day arrived when the line was so nearly finished that the chief engineer, who of course was British, decided that the time had come for a little celebration. And so he organized a sumptuous picnic banquet round about the Transvaal border, and he invited all the local bigwigs. To take them there, he laid on a special train decorated with flags and bunting. He even had a priest to sprinkle the little engine with holy water. Now, all the food and drink for the banquet was in a second train due to follow a little later, and the waiters as well. However, long after the speechifying had ended, and stomachs were starting to rumble and tongues were parched, there was still no sign of the food train. Eventually, when it did arrive, several hours late, the trucks were bare. Some of the British navvies had hijacked the train and polished off the lot all the food and liquor. And to rub salt in the wound, they sent the chief engineer a message to say that they duly drunk his health in his own precious wine. On Christmas Day, 1887, the Portuguese section of the line had reached the border. The way was clear to carry the line forward to Pretoria. Now, President Kruger had granted the concession to build and operate railways within his republic to a Netherlands company, the Nederlandse Zuid-Afrikaanse Spoorwegmaatschappij, better known as ZASM. And their first step was to establish their main base at Komatipoort, a hot and squalid camp, as someone once wrote about it, cursed by scorching sun all day, and amid Hollanders, full-blooded and fresh from Europe, were always early victims. Your chance of survival was less than 1 in 7. A corpse under every sleeper was the way they put it. So here they lie, their only headstone, a bushveld tree, or the waving grass.
Hij verkwikt mijn ziel. Hij leidt mij in het spoor der gerechtigheid om zijns naams wil. Al ging ik ook in een dal der schaduw des doods, ik zou geen kwaad vrezen.
Early one summer's morning, the old president was sitting on his stoop here, sipping his usual cup of coffee, when a visitor arrived. He was George Pauling, and he'd come to ask the president for more railway contracts. Well, it so happened that some years before, when Kruger and his colleagues were on their way back from an abortive visit to London, no hotel in the Cape would accommodate them. Well, one evening, a railway official came upon Kruger and his colleagues, this party of his, more or less dossing down on the platform at Kraankale station, and he offered them the use of his office to spend the night. Now, that railway official was George Pauling's brother Frank, and Kruger never forgot that act of kindness, and he told Pauling he could have any contract he wanted. Now, the contract that Pauling wanted more than any other was that section of Kruger's line from the border at Komatipoort to where it was poised at the entrance to the formidable and infamous Crocodile Poort. It was one of the most awesome engineering projects ever attempted in South Africa. And if any man could do it, that man was George, twisting and turning and wiggling along the valley of the Elands River. In just 65 kilometers, it rose 500 meters until it reached the final hurdle, where the cool Highveld unlooses its cascading waterfall over the escarpment. The land tumbles into the hot valley below. I wonder how often they must have stood here, gazed up at the edge of that great escarpment, wondered how they could bridge the gap that stood between them and the cool breezes of the Highveld over 200 meters above. They began by cutting through solid rock for a whole kilometer. And then they drove this tunnel 213 meters and working from both ends to emerge eventually on the Highveld plain at Watervalboven, a rise of 1,500 meters from where the line had begun at Delagoa Bay 7 years before. To cope with the steep gradient, they built a 4-kilometer rack railway that used a special engine. That's how they finally reached the Highveld plain. The rest of the way to Pretoria was more or less plain sailing. So there were 3 railroad concerns, all panting to be first at the Witwatersrand goldfields. The Cape tentacles stretched as far as Kimberley, Halliwell North and Colesberg, and the Natal line from Durban was crawling through the mountains towards the frontier. And so began a race that in concept, if not in scale, rivaled the dash across the mountains and Cape could reach the Transvaal. It must first cross the Republic of the Orange Free State, and the farmers there made their feelings very clear to President Brunt. No railway. He said, "You may not agree with me now, but our children will convey all their goods and produce by train, and they will fly through the air in machines like birds." Now, he said that in 1888, 14 years before the Wright brothers took to the air in what was to be the first powered flight in history. It was unlikely that a man of the vision of President Brunt would hold up progress, and by 1889, he'd given the green light for the Cape lines to cross the Free State to the Transvaal border. The upshot was that by Christmas 1890, a train from Colesberg was steaming into Bloemfontein. Naturally, this railhead put Kruger in a quandary. He'd planned, you see, to keep the lines from the Cape and Natal at arm's length until his own line from Delagoa Bay reached the Witwatersrand. He felt that he owed it to all those who'd invested in the railway to give it a good 6-month start. But as the days went by, he found it more and more difficult to refuse the gold mines a rail outlet to the sea. So, in June 1890, Kruger made up his mind. The Cape could carry its railway forward from Bloemfontein to the Transvaal border at Viljoensdrift on the Vaal, but the rail link from there to Johannesburg would have to be built with the Netherlands-South Africa Railway Company. Enter now Cecil John Rhodes, Prime Minister of the Cape and Chairman of De Beers. Rhodes looked at the map, then he looked at the railways, and then he had an idea. Took a hand, because one day came the news that the Delagoa line had run out of money and had come to a standstill at Nelspruit. Kruger sat and pondered. What could he do? The line on which he staked absolutely everything was bankrupt. What could he do? Then, ironically, it was Rhodes and the Cape government that came to the rescue and bailed him out, on condition that the Cape would carry their line forward to Johannesburg over a bridge built by the Netherlands Company. Kruger turned up for the opening, and so did Francis William Rates, the new president of the Free State. And that's how the Cape Government Railways won the race to Johannesburg, because at 11 minutes to 12, on the 15th of September 1892, a train from Cape Town steamed into Johannesburg. The journey had taken 2 days, 14 hours and 17 minutes. Sadly for Kruger, it was to be another 2 years before his line from Delagoa Bay, the Zazen line, was to reach Pretoria. And it wasn't until the 15th of December 1895 that the Natal line reached the goldfields. Kruger had held it up at the border for 4 weary years. So, by Christmas Day of that year, All the important centres in South Africa were linked together, and for the moment, it seemed as if the barometer for the Boer republics and the British colonies was set at fair, at last.